Everything you wanted to know about the scandal rocking college basketball, but might have been afraid to ask. All that and more next on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony. Waits for it. It's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison. Brady gets terrific.
Throws it, get it, touchdown, Knight again.
Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson. Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Colliger at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good. He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris hacks a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming, sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace. Welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. And man, we are jam-packed this week. Big Ten tournament predictions coming up here a little bit later on. Michael Spath of WTKA in Ann Arbor will be joining us. The huge news surrounding the Michigan football program, the end of the Tim Drevno era, what that does and doesn't mean. Michigan hockey surging. We're going to get to a lot of stuff here during this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. But I want to begin by saying, first of all, thank you. We crossed over 2,000 subscribers here on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for that. All of you that subscribe, and we get so many comments on every episode, every single week. Keep those coming. I try to respond to as many as I possibly can. Those of you that listen to this on iTunes or on Stitcher, again, thank you to that. And if you're willing to leave us a positive review or even a positive review or a like here on YouTube or on iTunes and Stitcher, those are greatly appreciated. They help us to get the word out about what we're doing each week here on Michigan Podcast as well. And don't forget, if you're just like, hey, we wonder what Michigan Podcast thinks about this story that breaks later in the week, we're always giving you up-to-the-minute commentary via Twitter at Michigan Podcast. I want to lead off this week, though, by taking a good deal amount of time, if you'll indulge me, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions and, frankly, a lot of shoddy reporting and analysis happening about the scandal that is currently rocking college basketball. I think some of this is deflection. Some of it is, these are my buddies. I don't want to tell the truth. And I just think a lot of it is, it's not a sports story now. I think what we're watching here is really a political story. And that's really where I want to begin. Because as some of you know, my full-time job is in politics, but I have built a moat around my day job and Michigan Podcast because I think, I know the term has kind of been bastardized, but I think we need some safe spaces in a culture. Sports should be a place where in Americana, we come together and just enjoy the fruits of what it means to be an American. We've got dozens of other places we can kill ourselves over politics. Sports shouldn't be one. But this week on Michigan Podcast, I'm going to use my expertise developed for my full-time career to analyze what's happening here. Because what you're watching is what we see in politics all of the time. What you're watching here are coordinated leaks. with the intent of bringing to light via the media in order to change and alert public opinion for the purposes of getting the result the leakers desire. In this case, I think it's pretty obvious that the source of these leaks is within the FBI itself, and their desire is to clean up what we've known for years is the most corrupt sport in America other than boxing, and that's college basketball. It's been asked many times, even by people in the media who are lawyers. They've asked, hey, what is the crime the FBI is investigating here? So either the people asking this are ignorant of criminal or tax law, or they're just shills for their meal ticket sport. Because what's been happening here all along, if the charges are true, is a form of money laundering. What do I mean by that? Well, no one is itemizing, hey, I gave 25 GER to a recruit under the table. No one's putting that on their expense reports, guys. All right. I'm sure Chuck Person, one of the coaches implicated in this, the assistant at Auburn who's already been indicted, I doubt on his tax form last April he put, gave recruit's mom 20 grand under the table. No one's itemizing that stuff. And often it's going through third parties. What do we call that? What do we call money when it goes from one source to another to be made clean, to be scrubbed? That's called money laundering. And that, my friends, is what we call a criminal conspiracy, which is simply nothing more than two or more parties taking part in such an endeavor. And that is what the FBI is investigating, which doesn't even get into the tax evasion and other issues still to come. There is so much unreported income here, from the bagmen / agents to the players / parents. It's definitely worth the Fed's time, especially if this goes back decades. That's why these leaks we've gotten in the last week or so are hitting now. They're hitting on purpose. The story first blew up in September, just as practice was getting underway around the country. Cast a pall over the entire season. And then it went dormant for months while the college sports world was focused on football. And now it's coming back in February. Football's out of mind. It's over. Signing day's come and gone. All our attention is now on hoops. And then suddenly, voila! Here are more leaks. Just as the punditry was saying, well, this story, it really wasn't that big of a deal. It's much ado about nothing. And now, with Selection Sunday, about 10 days away, we are now getting actual documentation of what's happening. Whoever's doing this in the FBI is a pro and is clearly intent on using what he, she, they know to provoke a long overdue reckoning in college basketball, including throwing out the names of high-profile players whose eligibility the rest of the way, in some cases, will now be in question. This is also why you're getting piecemeal leaks, why they escalate in fashion rather than the whole thing in one fell swoop. One big drop is a bombshell for a day or two, and then we're distracted. We have short attention spans nowadays. So instead what you do is you carefully coordinate smaller bombshells so that you make up for the shock value in volume, because that's what holds our attention. And eventually the public outcry will become somebody do something when you reach a critical mass. That's why the first spreadsheet is just one. There are many more. And those wiretaps, by the way, those are the Watergate tapes. Now, what do I mean by the Watergate tapes? Well, if you go back to the history of Watergate, Congress is holding hearings. What did the president know and when did he know it? Both sides, both parties are sort of doing their partisan dance for the cameras. And then a guy named Alexander Butterfield inadvertently mentions in his testimony, well, Nixon records everything that's said in the Oval Office. All of a sudden, congressmen of various ideological, political persuasions look at each other and they're like, stuff just got real, because now there's a record. And that's what those wiretaps are. See, let me pause here for just a moment. Remember the story? Hey, half of the teams in those Sweet 16 seeds the NCAA Selection Committee put out a couple of weeks ago could eventually find themselves on the wrong end of an NCAA investigation. Well, people started looking at those Sweet 16 seeds and they're like, well, wait, everybody that's been busted here so far, they're an Adidas person. There's only one Adidas school in these Sweet 16 seeds. That's Kansas. So where are all these other teams coming from? See, the wiretaps are the thing in which you'll catch the conscience of the king. What that tells me, because we've had busts at Auburn, Nike school, Arizona, Nike school. What that tells me is the wiretaps have picked up crossfire, meaning source A says, we've got to give a certain amount of money to get this recruit because this other shoe company and or their coach, their bag man, are in on this kid and their offer is blankety blank. Those wiretaps, that will be the smoking gun. And we're already seeing that. This source or sources in the FBI, they're not going to allow the NCAA to look the other way on this. The NCAA, this is their big meal ticket. Over 80% of the NCAA's revenue every year comes from the men's basketball tournament. Why? Because they don't control any of the purse strings in college football. So that's why they'll look at North Carolina potentially committing academic fraud for 10 years and then say, never mind, as you were. This is their meal ticket. But the FBI is like, we're not playing that game anymore. So listen, strap in. Legacies are going down hard. Banners, more of them, like what happened at Louisville last week, will be removed. Halos, like what's already happened to Sean Miller and Rick Pitino, will be tarnished. Fans are going to be calling shows with their excuses falling on deaf ears. The forecast for the next few months in college basketball is pain. And then we've had now new revelations. And I've seen a lot of shoddy reporting about that too. First of all, we're starting to see a trend. Some in the media were previously calling for us to clean up college basketball are now wanting to jump right to the reform endgame because some specific schools and names are in play. That's what we call deflection, my friends. These are people in the media that are not truly interested in reform. Otherwise, they'd want the full brunt of the scandal to be known first. Because what are we going to reform until we know for certain how far down the rabbit hole goes? So I'm sorry, not sorry. Your alma mater / former or favorite coach is now in the crosshairs. They're not a victim. They're potential participants and willing ones, if they're guilty, in a criminal conspiracy to essentially launder money for the sake of circumventing a federally regulated nonprofit called the NCAA. All right? That's another thing. The NCAA can't sweep this under the rug if they want to. They're a federally regulated nonprofit, and the feds are now involved. Once the full scale is known of the scandal, and then we have accountability for individuals and institutions that participated, then we have the conversation about long-term reform. Otherwise, if we don't, then people will just say, well, they got away with it, so we'll just go ahead and be emboldened to circumvent the new system we reformed to. Children will act out unless they are punished. See, the problem here isn't the system. Yes, the system needs reformed, but the problem is human nature. And if you don't hold human nature accountable, it will ruin or corrupt any system. And that human nature has gone unchecked for decades now because the NCAA was not serious about holding its cash cow, men's basketball, accountable. As I said earlier, the NCAA does not hold the purse strings to college football. It makes almost no money off of it. Instead, almost its entire budget comes from the men's basketball tournament. Nor do I buy this talking point, the NCAA won't do anything here. Normally, I'm the one who tells you always err on the side of cynicism. But this, again, it's a federally regulated nonprofit. It is the feds who are arresting people, who are indicting people, who are going to be sending people to prison, who have already, through their own leaks, caused 2 of the top coaches in this sport to be kicked to the curb in Rick Pitino and Sean Miller. The idea that you can sweep this under the rug is nuts. Nuts. Genie is already out of the bottle. You cannot put it back in. Keep this in mind. Every single person in the media who has attempted to downplay this story since it first broke last September, every single one has been wrong. Now, when we eventually drive the money changers out of the temple, then we need a conversation about reform. I'm probably going to do an entire show about that as we get into the off season. You cannot outright pay players. Title IX won't allow that. I'll explain that a little bit more in depth in a later program. And besides outright paying the players, it's a bad deal for them. They become employees. And depending on your employee model, everything they get now, from healthcare to training table to athletic training to books, room and board, everything now becomes taxable income. It's a bad deal for the players. All right? And there's no reason maybe to not look at an Olympic model where third parties can pay them for anything they want. They are American adults. Those payments I don't think would be as extravagant as detractors claim. I mean, if DeAndre Ayton at Arizona is allegedly worth $100,000 on a black market, he would be worth less than that on an honest market where income is taxed and reported. Okay, but we will save that conversation for later. For now, let's go back to the scandal and another deflection. Well, this happens in college football too. Of course, that's true to some extent. So what? You know, when one of my kids does something wrong, they don't get away with it because their sibling acted out as well. You know, since I'm dad and I'm the adult, you know what I do? I punish both their asses. That's what I do. Okay, so I cannot believe some smart adults who fancy themselves Mark Emmert's personal accountability partner, not mentioning any names, Jay Billis, are rolling out with this banal talking point. That is childlike deflection, and it's not even smart. Not to mention, agents are not as regularly involved with football prospects before they become college athletes like they are in basketball. Because in football, kids have to be 3 years removed from high school before they're eligible for the NFL. There are no ones and dones. So often the cheating in college football is directly between a school and a coach and the player, like what you saw at Ole Miss, for example. Not so much a third party forming a criminal conspiracy with runners and agents, because you don't have the one and done phenomenon like you do in football, and that's what the FBI has uncovered in hoops. Finally, I want to make this point too. I saw the coach at Xavier has tried this and some others have. No, homie's not playing that. Any coach who attempts to tell you they don't know any agents, they never engaged any of them, they're lying. I'll just flat out tell you, anybody who's been implicated in this for recruiting elite kids who tells you they've never run into any agents or don't know any are lying to you. Here's why. These players have a network. They have a network around them. And these elite college prospects in the basketball level, they're a brand. They've got many corporations and family members around them. Look at football. There's a reason Harbaugh is climbing trees and spending the night and riding go-karts with siblings. You have to recruit for these elite kids. You have to recruit the inner circle, not just the player. And in basketball, that includes the agents for these elite kids they've already come into contact with. And as a coach, by the way, you can't just have a good relationship with one agent. These kids are spread out over up to a dozen agents. So you've got to have good relationships with the agents across the board if you want to recruit those elite kids. So any coach who claims ignorance is probably lying. Furthermore, NCAA rules make the head coach responsible for the actions of his assistants, whether he knew or not. So, for example, if it turns out Stevens, the assistant coach at Michigan State, who is implicated in one of the reports, if indeed he is guilty of what he was implicated with in that report, Izzo is on the hook as well, regardless of his claim of a lack of foreknowledge. Those are NCAA rules. So stay tuned. This story is at the end of the beginning. It is not at the beginning of the end. Now, a couple of other things that have come up I want to address. I don't think kids like Miles Bridges should be losing their eligibility over $40 dinners or lunches. But what Michigan State did do this week is they provided the first independent corroboration of that spreadsheet that came out with all of those dollar figures last week. And that wasn't the only place Miles Bridges' name came up. It also came up with a $400 what the spreadsheet called advance to his mom. What's that an advance for? If you believe Michigan State or any institution can truly investigate that in 24 hours, I got a hole in the ozone layer to sell you. That's nuts. They can't. What I think's essentially happened here is that these schools, because another question that's being asked is, well, why is Sean Miller suspended at Arizona but DeAndre Ayton is still playing? Well, if indeed the worst suspicions about Miles Bridges and DeAndre Ayton and others are learned to be confirmed, then what that means is they've been ineligible this entire time. Even if all Miles Bridges' mother received was $400, a specific NCAA bylaw says you lose a third of your season for that. Any improper benefit, impermissible benefit that ranged between $300 to $500, that's a third of your season. So if you're talking about the dollar amounts that DeAndre Ayton is alleged to have gotten, if that was just a cash advance for much larger amounts, well, then it is quite possible DeAndre Ayton and Miles Bridges have been ineligible this entire time, which means if you're those schools, you're already forfeiting those games and vacating those games anyway. You might as well just play it out now. They're your best players, and who knows, they may even turn out to be innocent. You've got nothing to lose by playing them now. You are judgment-proof at this point. And here's the other thing about this scandal. When the one-and-done culture took over, Duke basketball was in an era where Mike Krzyzewski had been to one Final Four in 8 years. That was his largest drought since the first 8 years he was at Duke when he was building the program in the 80s. Since Mike Krzyzewski embraced the one-and-done culture, Duke's won 2 national championships. See, that's why these coaches do it. Because they like to win. Yeah, Sean Miller was making millions of dollars, but he wasn't getting to Final Fours and winning national championships. Sure, Mike Krzyzewski had won a couple of national titles with great four-year players like Shane Battier and Christian Laettner and Bobby Hurley. But then he's looking at what guys like John Calipari and others are doing. He's like, you know what? I'd like to win more of those national titles, so I guess I got to get some of those players. This story is going to blow the lid off of this sport. Don't believe anybody telling you this thing's going away. The NCAA will sweep it away. What they essentially did with Miles Bridges and some of these guys in advance of March Madness is they issued a continuance and said, for now, we're going to let this go. Oh, but believe me, we've already seen 2 high-profile casualties among the coaching ranks in Sean Miller and Rick Pitino. They will not be alone. Back here on Michigan Podcast, and there's a look at our Patreon page. And if you stop right there for just a second, you'll notice that while we were off last week, I put together a podcast, 4 weeks till Selection Sunday, where Michigan basketball stands. And that kind of was able to tide you over while we took a 1-week hiatus since signing day. And if you're one of the folks that is supporting us on Patreon, you got to take advantage of that. You got to listen to that. And we greatly appreciate your support. I know a lot of you ask us, hey, what can we do to get more content from you guys? Well, keep in mind, we are taking time away from the stuff that actually feeds our families to put this together as a labor of love every single week. And so if there is a group of you out there that says, hey, we really support what you're doing, we want more of it, this is one surefire way to get us to open up more of our schedule to produce even more content. And plus, if you're a Patreon supporter, you get access to exclusive content separate from what we put out here for free on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and YouTube every week as well. So check us out. Check us out at patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. Big Ten tournament predictions. Here's what I think is going to happen at Madison Square Garden. I think on Wednesday, Illinois beats Iowa because they overplay. They have that overplay defense. I don't think Iowa's guards match up very well with that. Rutgers, they played a game at Madison Square Garden earlier this year, played very well. Mild upset. I think they beat Minnesota in a de facto home game. Which brings us to Thursday. I like Maryland over Wisconsin. I think Maryland will come out like a house of fire. When you look at the way they were embarrassed in the season finale, I think they'll come out with a little spit and vinegar. I think Michigan beats Illinois. I think Penn State over Northwestern, which looks like it's Northwestern looks to me like a team that just wants the season to be over. Indiana over Rutgers. And then we get to quarterfinal Friday, and I hate to go chalk, but the best 4 teams in the Big Ten were demonstrably better than the rest of this league. I mean, there's a huge drop-off. When you look at all the metrics, RPI, Ken Palm, etc., once you get past Michigan, Michigan State, Purdue, and Ohio State, the drop-off metrically, analytically, is massive. And I think you're going to see that in the results on Friday. I like Michigan State over Maryland. I like all the chalk. I think Michigan gets revenge on Nebraska as well. Saturday semifinals, I'll go with Sparty in a revenge spot against Michigan, but I think that game will be a brawl. And I like Purdue over Ohio State. And then Sunday, I think Purdue beats the winner of the Michigan-Michigan State game. I just think that Michigan-Michigan State game will be such a Donnybrook, so physical, so tense. Coming back the very next day after that, I think it's going to be tough for whoever wins that game. And I think Purdue, I think this little losing streak they had will be a blessing in disguise, kind of a course correction, gets them back focused, and I think they win the Big Ten tournament this weekend. We'll find out what Michael Spath of WTKA in Ann Arbor thinks about that and more next. Back here on Michigan Podcast, joined again this week by our good friend Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor. Good to see you, Michael. Go Blue. How are you?
I am doing great today, Steve. Live from the WTKA studios. This is where I record my show every single day. So welcome here.
This is where the magic takes place, as they like to say.
That's overselling it. That's really overselling it there.
Did we outkick our coverage, do you think, or not on that?
You know what? I'm used to kicking my coverage if you've seen pictures of my wife. So no, we're okay. I think we're good.
It's theater of the mind, brother, theater of the mind. And there's a ton going on. I don't even know where to start. Let's begin with the departure of Tim Drevno that was finalized late last week. Michigan's erstwhile offensive coordinator / offensive line coach apparently didn't take too kindly to the reassignment of duties and decided that he was going to move on to seek out some greener pastures. We don't really yet know what the result of this will be on the field, what it will look like with Ed Warner, who's considered a top offensive line coach, taking over that position full-time. But Tim Drevno was considered a top offensive line coach 3 years ago as well. Or what it looks like with, the former Florida coach, Jim McElwain, taking over the play calling duties. You know, we have tried former Nick Saban offensive coordinators on national championship teams before with Doug Nussmeier, and it didn't work. Now, both these things may work perfectly. They may flame out. I do think we can safely say this. One of the narratives since the season is that Harbaugh has his guys. He'll just sit there. He's arrogant. Meritocracy for thee, but not for me. Well, he's replaced the strength and conditioning coach. He said goodbye to Tim Drevno. Those were two of maybe his closest friends other than his own son on the staff. So I think we can say that at the very least, the merciless Harbaugh is still here. Whether these moves will work or not, we don't know. But he's not gone soft, Michael.
No, I would imagine. I think that's probably pretty fair to say that he has not gone soft. That he knew he had to make some changes to this offensive coaching staff, to this program, to realize the results that all of us as fans, members of the media, and Jim himself and the players in the athletic department were expecting when he became the head coach in 2015. And losing Drevno, I caution, and I think you did a good job of mentioning that Ed Warner comes in and people are excited about it. But as you and I have talked about multiple times, we were super excited about Tim Drevno 3 years ago. So I don't think we can sit here and go like, well, this is an upgrade or this is a surefire until we see it happen, because it just seems like offensive line has become like this black hole of Michigan football for a myriad of reasons. But man, just cannot seem to get it back to the right spot, to a place where you have the Jake Longs of the world and Steve Hutchinson. And even I say Jeff Backus, my goodness. I think right now, Steve, you and I would take a Jeff Backus at left tackle, which is a very good player, but never a great player. But we would take it in a heartbeat. And I think
I'd settle for Patrick Omame and Michael Schofield at this point.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where we're at. Patrick Omame, Elliott Mueller.
Yeah.
Who else was on that offensive line? Ricky Barnum, I think, was on that offensive line in 2011.
Dave Moak, who won the Remington Award, right?
David Moak. I mean, that's the best line Michigan's had in a decade, was that group there, and that's kind of sad, a little bit sad. But no, the one thing that I do caution is it's kind of like the backup quarterback, right? It's kind of like last year Michigan saying, well, Wilton Spate's not good enough, but John O'Corn will be the guy. John O'Corn's not good enough, so Brandon Peters will be the guy. Brandon Peters is not good enough, Shea Patterson will be the guy. And so everybody's like, well, Tim Drevno wasn't good enough. He's the scapegoat. He's the guy that didn't get the job done. And we really don't know who is the guy that didn't get the job done. But maybe we'll find out. Maybe we'll find out if things take off and Jim McElwain is some really creative person. I just caution to say that everything was Tim Drevno's fault when you and I both know how this offensive system, how this offensive game plan was coming together, and it wasn't just about one guy making bad decisions.
Here's what I do like, though. You know, if you and you're closer to the situation, obviously being there in Ann Arbor than we are. But, you know, the conventional wisdoms / urban legends the last few years were we lost arguably our best recruiter in Ty Wheatley because he didn't see a chance for upward mobility in the program and didn't want to stick with just being a college running backs coach. You know, yet we lost Jed Fish because there was some palace intrigue between him and Tim Drevno. He really thought, you know, hey, you know, I'm the passing game coordinator. You know, it was our passing game that saved the season with Jake Rudock. Why am I not calling more of the shots here in 2016? It's him or me. He moved on. We don't know how much of these things are true, but these are sort of this is the vernacular that we're dealing with. And now we had this situation with Drevno that no one doubts what his credentials were as an offensive line coach. There's a lot of doubt, however, about how good of an offensive coordinator he was. Here's what I like. We're coming to clarity. We know from his time at Ohio State, Ed Warner's not a great offensive coordinator. But we do know he's one hell of an offensive line coach. We know Tim Drevno's one too, but he apparently didn't want to just be an offensive line coach. So in this case, we've gone from having one guy coaching the interior of the offensive line as a man-blocking scheme while he coordinates the offense, alongside another guy who's coaching the tackles while he's a zone-blocking scheme. We have one guy who we know is one hell of an offensive line coach. Go ahead, Michael.
How did they think that was going to work?
I know.
You have two coaches coaching two different parts of the offensive line with two drastically different philosophies on what makes a successful offensive line. Oh, man, I just want to, you know.
And we do know from people like Bill Green at 24/7 Sports and other places, in terms of recruiting, if it's essentially we just traded one guy who's willing to be a great offensive line coach for another great offensive line coach who doesn't want to be that anymore, I think we clearly got an upgrade in recruiting from Ed Warner to Tim Drevno. So in that respect, I'm excited.
I mean, the best thing that could have happened with Ed Warner, I hate to say it, but is that he became the offensive coordinator of Ohio State and failed. And he figured out it's almost like Brady Hoke coming to the University of Michigan, being the head coach and failing. And Brady Hoke is a hell of a defensive line coach. Mm-hmm. And Brady Hoke is probably a really good coach in the right environment. But sometimes you've got to shoot for the stars and miss to realize what you're really good at. And part of that, too, I mean, we're talking about Tim Drevno and Ed Warner, but maybe that's what Jim McElwain. That's the conversation that you and I have had a couple of times here. Maybe Jim McElwain is just a really good offensive mind that did some really nice things as the offensive coordinator with Alabama and did some really nice things when he was the head coach at Colorado State, when he was very much more in control of that offense. And he just really wasn't a guy ready to be a big-time head coach at a place like Florida. So if that's the case, and you've got two coaches that have kind of figured out their path and figured out what they're really good at, and they can be those two coaches at the University of Michigan, then that's a huge win for Michigan. You combine that with Al Washington coming in to coach the linebackers and a noted recruiter, and Sharon Moore coming in to coach the tight ends and is also considered a great recruiter. And you're right, it sounds like what you've had happen here is you've traded out some guys that were maybe bristling at their role and were not great recruiters, for bringing in guys that know their role, at least to begin with, at least for 2018 and hopefully 2019, and are guys that are interested in recruiting. And no matter how you look at that, that is obviously a big step forward for Michigan football.
All right, Michael, let's quickly now transition to basketball. The Big Ten tournament getting underway tomorrow as of the time that we are going to air with this on Tuesday. When you look at the way Michigan finished the season, to me, I thought the game at Penn State was one of, if not the most impressive win of the year other than at Michigan State, and here's why. Because that was your classic letdown spot. Coming off a huge emotional win, your senior day, your final home game of the year against your arch rival Ohio State. You go on the road. Penn State is desperate. Like Michigan, they were one of only 20 teams in college basketball that going into that game ranked in the top 25 or top 50 nationally in both offensive and defensive efficiency. in KenPom. They had already beaten Ohio State twice. Their backs were against the wall. For Michigan to go in there and win that game by double digits, I thought that was the sort of game where that was a separation game. You are clearly saying we belong in a different tier of teams when we make a statement like that. But then they followed it up with just, I think you described it on the radio as a blitzkrieging. That is what they did to Maryland. I think it was their worst home loss as a program since 1998, and just absolutely dominated them from stem to stern, even with only getting 8 points out of Mo Wagner at the exact same time. The way this team has finished the season, it is really hard not to let your expectations go to places that are typically dangerous for them to go to, Michael.
Well, I think you're spot on there. I mean, I think it's natural for fans of every college basketball, college football, pro team, but maybe more so for Michigan basketball, just because, the run by Trey Burke and Tim Hardaway was a little bit of a surprise. And then the following year, you had a lot of confidence because of Nick Stauskas stepping up. But, I mean, there's almost like this element of always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Michigan to lose a game that they should win, to lose a tough game on the road. And it's like we don't have enough confidence and swagger, and I almost want to say borderline arrogance in our own team. We don't just sit there believe that they're the better team, they're going to find a way to win. But what the last couple of weeks have done for me, Steve, and I wonder if it's happened for you too, is I'm starting to have that swag when it comes to this Michigan basketball team. I'm starting to think, when people talk about, they're going to the Big Ten tournament and Michigan State and Purdue and Ohio State are the favorites, I'm starting to say, like, not to borrow an adage from Jim Harbaugh, but why not us? Mm-hmm. Like, I believe this group, when you look at it, is a true team. They've got really good bench play right now with Duncan Robinson, Jordan Poole, and John Teskey. And Jerron Simmons is kind of getting that mix. Muhammad Ali-Abdul-Rahman, this past week against Minnesota was fantastic. He's usually not a 25-point scorer, but he's almost always a 16 to 18-point scorer consistent. So is Moritz Wagner. Xavier Simpson has cleaned up enough of his game. He's in a little bit of a shooting, slump, but the rest of his game is really good. I mean, I think it's time to start believing that this team is going to win these games, as opposed to expecting, like, okay, is this going to be the game where kind of the tide goes against us and all of a sudden Michigan's out of it? Instead, we should be going into every single basketball game because this is what they've proven to us, and this is the way that their defense has been all year, and start saying, we're going to win this game. There's not going to be any part of me that fears losing this. Every single part of me is just going to enjoy this process because I feel good about our team coming out on top at the end of the day.
I like the use of the word swag. And, I know he has struggled in the last month, but I think Charles Matthews, with the way he started the season, the way he physically attacked the rim, helping to lead the comeback against UCLA when they had that famous timeout, and John Beilein looked at him and said, right now you're the best blanking player on the court for UCLA. Why don't you try being the best player for Michigan the rest of the game? And that really sparked him. And Jordan Poole adds that swag. The way Duncan Robinson goes out there and bodies guys on defense, this is not your typical kind of choir boy, John Beilein stereotypical team, which isn't quite an accurate stereotype, but has been the stereotype nonetheless. And what I like about this team's chances in March, and when you look at two things that usually speak to good NCAA tournament success, I believe since the advent of the KenPom rankings, only one team that wasn't in the top 40 nationally in his defensive efficiency rankings has won a national title, and that was that Duke team that was loaded with pros and one-and-dones that beat Wisconsin a few years ago. And then when you can put, I call it the rule of three. Because when you get to the NCAA tournament, you're playing various systems and styles, and you can't always dictate the style against the opponent. You're playing in a sterile environment on a neutral court. The officiating styles can radically alter from one game to the next in terms of how ticky-tack they call it, how much they let it go. So can you adapt and evolve? And that's where I look to see, can you put three guys on the court that can get their own offense, meaning when your sets don't work, can just simply say, you know what, like a Trey Burke, we'll call a 1-4 set at the top of the screen, or a Nick Stauskas will run a ball screen. I can get you my own offense. no matter what combination Michigan puts on the court, when they go to their second unit or their starters, they can consistently put 3 guys, sometimes more than that can get their own offense outside the flow of the offense. When you play defense the way Michigan does, when you have that kind of offensive versatility, as long as you're just not crapping the bed at the free throw line, which is our big Achilles heel, you're a really tough out, Michael.
Yeah, and it was funny as you were saying that, I was trying to count to myself, okay, you've got Muhammad Ali, Abdur Rahman that can get his own shot. You've got Moritz Wagner, especially when he gets the ball at the top of the key and puts himself in a position where he's, he loves that behind the back to himself, where he goes in and goes around a guy. Xavier Simpson is not the best shooter, but he's a guy that can get to the rim pretty consistently. Jordan Poole is maybe the one with the highest upside because he just seems to say, like, I don't care who's defending me. I've got that confidence in myself that I can get to the basket. I can step back and take my three-pointer. So that's 4 guys right there. And I don't even include Charles Matthews, who has been a little bit of a slump, but as you pointed out, is someone that can definitely get to the basket and has come up with some big shots for Michigan throughout this season. And, what's interesting to me is when you look at this year, and there's always ebbs and flows in any given season, but really you've had 2 players in Muhammad and Moritz Wagner that coming into the year, you felt pretty confident in what they're going to give you on a consistent basis. And for the most part, those guys have delivered game in and game out. At different times this year, you had a point guard problem. You didn't know who was going to be a point guard. Well, look what the job that John Beilein and his assistants have done to develop Xavier Simpson as the point guard. And now here we are, when a month ago we had written off Deron Simmons completely, and now here he is as a potentially significant contributor as a backup. And then you looked at guys like Jordan Poole that had some flurry of success early on, but went through the normal freshman wall and now is back to playing really well. Charles Matthews and Duncan Robinson have gone through their slumps, and this coaching staff has found a way to get the very best out of player after player after player this year. And with the exception of Matthews, everybody seems to be in a really good spot going into tournament time. And I'll tell you what, Charles Matthews scored in double figures against Maryland. He hit a three-pointer down the stretch. He had a couple of big shots. And the John Beilein MO of sticking with the player and constantly giving him that confidence and backing him up and supporting him has paid off so many times in the past. And it looks like on the surface that this is going to pay off again with Charles Matthews at the most opportune time.
When you go back to that 2013 team, you mentioned ebbs and flows. I mean, Nick Stauskas started that year on fire. Then he kind of disappeared for a month and a half and then finished the year shooting the ball very well. Tim Hardaway was not shooting the ball well at the end of that season, despite, obviously being a future pro. We had the 2 other similarities we had between that team and this team. The stat line, remember the stat line in 2013 that Michigan was undefeated when Glenn Robinson III scored in double figures? Remember that stat? We have a similar stat line in this year's team with Duncan Robinson. Michigan, I think, is 19-0 when he gets 6 points or more. So we have a similar stat there where just as GR3 was sort of the swing player for Michigan, you have that same kind of swing player for Duncan Robinson. And another factor, too, Mitch McGary added some of that physical presence and swag that Beilein's teams had lacked, but had ups and downs, inconsistencies, and then about late February, a light came on, and he just dominated college basketball. The consciousness of the sport, he was in highlights. His presence changed the trajectory of Michigan's team. I wonder if you're starting to see that right now with Jordan Poole.
You could be dead on. And before I get to Poole, let me say about Duncan. We have said that this is not one of Beilein's best shooting teams, but when Duncan Robinson gets hot, how many times have we seen in the last couple of weeks where he gets hot and it changes the way that teams defend Michigan and has made it a little bit better for Moritz Wagner, has made it better for Xavier and Muhammad to get to the hoop. Will even create some opportunities for Charles Matthews, I think, here. And he is so critical, you're right, to the success of this basketball team because of his ability to just go on one of those runs. We saw it against Wisconsin, I believe, where he had 3 3-pointers in a really quick stretch, and against Iowa. He had some success against Penn State. He is such a critical factor going forward for Michigan. And when I talk about Jordan Poole, it's his exponential growth this last month has been off the charts. And I have gotten to the point where I'm sure like you, where I want him to have the ball in his hands on the offensive side. The defensive side,
oh boy,
being honest, Steve,
when he comes in on defense, just count to 3 because you won't get that far before somebody beats him on a backdoor overplay cut. Happens every time like clockwork, Michael, every time.
Yeah, I think maybe defensively he's still thinking about it a little bit because instead of just staying between his man and the basket, he's always kind of like looking at one corner by, where's the ball? Let me go for the ball, do something. And it's like, Jordan, just stay with your guy. Stop paying attention to the other things on the court and stay with your guy. He's got a little better on that. I think he's almost, Steve, it's one of those old things where you've got the cherry picker when you were a kid growing up and you've got the one guy that just wants to get down the court and throw the dunk down or is thinking so much about offense that he's not paying attention to his defense. I think that's going on a little bit with Jordan Poole, but on terms of the offensive side of it, I mean, he's skyrocketing his play, and he's going to be somebody when you get to tournament time, and especially as you get to the semifinals and finals of the Big Ten tournament, once you get past the Sweet 16, where you're going to be playing up against a lot of great elite players, elite talents, and they're going to have guys like Jordan Poole that can go in there and show off some of that athleticism and give Michigan an edge.
Big Ten tournament, do you have a prediction? What do you think's going to happen? I just gave my picks in the previous segment, and I think Michigan and Michigan State are going to play on Friday, or on Saturday, in the semifinals. And then I think that game is going to be such a slugfest. I think it's really hard to come back the very next day for one of those two teams. I like Purdue to win this tournament. What are your thoughts?
Actually, I'm pretty much right there with you, Steve. I agree with you that I think, especially from Michigan, that has to go through, Iowa, Illinois, then Nebraska, then Michigan State. Nebraska's going to be gunning for Michigan because they have to win to get to the NCAA tournament. They got to win the whole thing. Michigan State's going to be gunning for Michigan. Whoever makes it out of that Saturday semifinal, I think is going to be pretty spent emotionally to be able to come back and win and beat a team like Purdue that has a relatively easy path. They have to beat Ohio State, but has a relatively easy path to the championship game. And so I like Purdue in this whole thing. I think they had that little swoon of those 3 games that they lost in a row, and I think they're pretty motivated to show what they're capable of doing here and give fans this idea like, hey, when you get to the NCAA tournament, we're going to be able to rise up to meet this occasion. And so I'm right there with you. Purdue wins the whole thing. I do think Michigan State battle in the semifinals. I'm not quite yet ready to say which way that goes. Let me see how both teams are playing when they get to Saturday.
Finally, hockey, Big Ten tournament action on the hockey side gets underway this weekend as well. And, when you sat here at the first of the year and you looked at, and nobody expected Mel Pearson to completely just turn things around in year one overnight anyway. It may take a year or two to build the talent base back up. But when you looked at the schedule Michigan was facing, that murderer's row, I don't know anybody thought, man, this is a team that's going to end up making the NCAA tournament. And now it looks like they're an absolute lock for the tournament. They played their best hockey of the year against the toughest schedule that they faced all year as well. What's the ceiling for this team, Michael?
You know what? The NCAA hockey tournament is such a crapshoot because if you get a hot goalie and you're playing well as a team defensively, you can go really far in the NCAA tournament. And so in terms of winning the Big Ten, I think the Big Ten is probably, trying to go through Minnesota, trying to go through Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame's going to be licking their chops if they get a chance to play Michigan again. I don't see them win the Big Ten tournament. I do see them beating Wisconsin this weekend and getting to the semifinals. And then once they're in the NCAA tournament, it's all about the matchup. But if you're a 2-3 seed, you can beat that team. And then it's really just about who you're playing in that 1-4 game and where you're at. If you're in one of those teams like backyard, it's going to be a lot harder to win that game. But I honestly, right now, my prediction is Michigan goes to the NCAA tournament as like the number 1-3 seed, and then makes it through the first round of the NCAA tournament and gets to that chance to the Elite Eight and has a chance to go to the Frozen Four. But honestly, if they make it that far, you'd have to consider this season. You already consider this season a huge success, but that would be a monumental achievement for this program in year one of Mel Pearson.
Well, and you start talking about recruiting, and when you bring in an alum, and this is a historically great program that just slipped at the end under Red Berenson. It happens a lot with great coaches who maybe stay a year or two too long, but you don't also want to be the guy that goes to an all-time great coach and throws him out too early either. So you tend to err on the side of letting him stay longer than maybe he should. Talent base goes down a little bit. If you have that instant success, though, that exceeds expectations. That is, whether it's hockey, we've seen this in football, basketball, that is where recruiting, Michael, really takes off, because then the elite kids are like, hey, if you're getting this out of these guys, what are you going to get out of me?
Well, and it certainly will. It's a little bit different than football, because a program like Georgia that just won the national championship, they had that immediate impact in the 2018 recruiting class. And in hockey, these kids are being recruited 2-3 years out. And so what you could end up seeing is you could end up seeing Michigan hockey have a great season, and the next year they're bringing in a little bit better talent, but there could be a year where they make small strides, and then in 2 years and in 3 years, when the talent that's watching Michigan hockey right now, the kids that are 15, 16 years old, they decide that's where I want to be. What you could see is have a couple of years of growth, but not exponential growth, and then in 3 years have this big jump where Michigan hockey is the top team in the Big Ten and in a legitimate national championship contender, because they've gained all those recruits that are now starting to make their decisions on where they want to go for college hockey.
Michael Spath from WTKA, good to see you again, brother. Thanks for joining us here on the Michigan Podcast.
All right, thanks very much, and I'll look forward to having you on our show on Friday and certainly getting this Big Ten tournament going this Thursday. You
got it, Michael. Go Blue. More Michigan Podcast in a moment. This week's Twitter poll results. Do you think Jim McElwain is an upgraded offensive coordinator over Tim Drevno? 63% of you said yes. 15% of you said no. 22% of you gave the answer I would give. We don't know. I don't know how we could know that. I don't think it get much worse, but that doesn't necessarily always mean it's always going to get better. This week's question of the week here on the Michigan Podcast comes from an Iowa fan who asks, will the NCAA response to this bombshell move the Power 5, which is really the Power 6 in hoops, closer to creating their own separate governing body? No. The separate governing body is going to be driven by football and revenue alone. But I do think it will lead to massive sweeping reforms of college basketball, which are long overdue and will improve the sport. And I'll have some suggestions about that on a future episode here on Michigan Podcast. But I want to say this one more time. If you don't punish the people that cheated on the pre-existing rules, then they will just cheat your new ones as well. That's why discipline comes before reform. Well, don't forget, we love to know what you think about what we think here on Michigan Podcast. Follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. We try to engage as many of you as we can throughout the entire week. Want to thank our friends at Detroit Sports Podcast, who helps to get the word out about what we do here each and every week here on the Michigan Podcast as well. Next week, I decided to put it off because of all the breaking news. My prediction of what the NCAA tournament field will look like, we'll have that for you right here on Michigan Podcast. Until then, go Blue.